Hey boss, it's your brother, Disaster. First off, this intro is going to be a staple in all my upcoming videos. And as we've always said, our official motto is, it's winter all season long here. I don't care if you're dripping with sweat right now, step into our world and live the winter vibes with us. Quick tips for the best experience. Find a quiet, empty spot and sit by yourself if you're just looking for entertainment. But if you're planning to sleep, just lay back and relax on your bed. Put your headphones on, close your eyes, and set the video to autoplay. In either case, I need both of those eyes shut tight. That's it. Enjoy, boss. January in London is a meat locker. The air inside 221B was a toxic sludge of Holmes's high-grade tobacco and the acidic sting of a chemical experiment gone wrong. I was slumped in my chair, my thumb tracing the jagged scar on my leg, a souvenir from a war that felt like a fever dream. The mantle clock wasn't just ticking, it was hammering, a rhythmic metal-on-metal sound that grated on my nerves. Then the door didn't just open, it exploded. Lestrade stepped in, bringing the stench of wet pavement and adrenaline with him. He didn't say hello. He didn't take off his coat. He just slammed a heavy canvas evidence bag onto the mahogany table. The impact made a hollow, bone-dry thud, followed by the sharp crunch of shattering stone. "Someone's losing their mind, Holmes," Lestrade rasped, his voice sounding like a rusted saw. He ripped the bag open. White shards spilled across the table. They looked like human bone fragments, but they were cold, porous, and dead. It was the remains of a cheap plaster bust of Napoleon Bonaparte. I reached out and picked up a piece, a jagged chunk of the jawline. It was heavy, chalky, and left a dry, white residue that sucked the moisture right out of my skin. "3 houses in one night," Lestrade said, pacing the rug with a heavy, rhythmic stomp. "The guy ignores the silver. He ignores the cash. He goes straight for these 5-shilling busts and beats them into dust. He's not just breaking them, he's murdering them." Holmes didn't touch the plaster. He leaned in, his silhouette sharp and predatory against the flickering gaslight. He was looking at the impact points. "He's not a vandal, Lestrade," Holmes muttered, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "Look at the striations in the break. He's using a heavy, flat-headed tool. A hammer or a pry bar. He's looking for something hidden in the mold." The room went cold. Outside, the London fog was a yellow, suffocating wall pressing against the glass. The sound of carriage wheels on wet cobblestones echoed like distant gunfire. "It's a prank, Holmes," Lestrade insisted, but his hand was shaking as he reached for his notebook. "Pranks don't involve tactical break-ins at 3 high-security locations in 4 hours, Holmes snapped. He stood up, his movements like a switchblade opening. He turned to me, his eyes drilling into mine. "Watson, get your coat. And the Webley. The heavy one." I didn't ask questions. I lunged for the desk drawer. The smell of gun oil hit me immediately, sharp, metallic, and comforting. I grabbed the .455 service revolver. I flipped the cylinder open, the click-click-click of the mechanism was the only music I needed. I slid 6 heavy lead rounds into the chambers. The weight of the steel in my palm was the only reality that mattered. "New report just came in, Holmes," Lestrade whispered, his face turning the color of ash. "Kensington. A mansion. But this time, there's blood on the grass." The word blood shifted the gravity in the room. We took the stairs 3 at a time. My boots hammered against the wood, a loud, violent echo in the narrow hallway. We hit the street and the January cold slapped me across the face like a wet towel. We flagged a hansom. The leather seat was freezing, smelling of damp horsehair and old smoke. "Drive!" Holmes yelled. The driver lashed the horse. The crack of the whip sounded like a pistol shot. We surged into the dark, the wheels screaming as they caught the wet iron of the tram lines. I looked at Holmes. He was checking the action on his own pistol, his face a mask of cold, calculated violence. The 6 Napoleons wasn't a joke anymore, boss. It was an audit. And someone was about to pay the bill in red. The hansom skidded to a halt in front of a dark iron gate in Kensington. I stepped out, my boots sliding on the greasy slush. I looked at the railing. There was a smear on the black iron. I touched it. It was thick, warm, and smelled like a penny. The butcher was here. And he was still hungry. The iron gate groaned like a dying animal as I pushed it open. My hand was still slick with that warm, copper-smelling smear from the railing. We moved low, cutting through the shadows of the front garden. The fog was so thick you could chew it, a toxic, yellow soup that muffled every sound except the heavy thud of our boots in the slush. "There," Holmes hissed. A lone policeman was standing near a brick wall, his lantern shaking. The light was a weak, vibrating circle on the frozen grass. I didn't look at the officer, I looked at the ground. It was a crime scene written in white and red. The 4th Napoleon was gone. It had been reduced to a pile of jagged, chalky shrapnel. I knelt down, the damp cold of the earth soaking through my trousers immediately. I picked up a piece of the plaster, a section of the chest. It was heavy, porous, and crusted with a layer of dark, viscous fluid. The white dust was mixing with the blood, creating a thick, pink sludge that stained my fingertips. "Look at the impact, Watson," Holmes commanded, leaning over my shoulder. The statue hadn't just been dropped. It had been pulverized. There were deep gouges in the brick wall where the attacker had swung the bust with everything he had. He wasn't just searching, he was desperate. He was frantic. Then I saw the boots. 2 feet away, tucked into the shadow of a dead elm tree, was the body. It was a man, slumped against the wall like a discarded rag doll. I moved to him, my medical instincts taking over. My hands went to his neck. The skin was still radiating a faint, dying heat, but the throat was gone. A single, surgical horizontal rip had opened him from ear to ear. It wasn't a struggle, it was an execution. His coat was cheap, coarse wool, now saturated with a heavy, wet weight that made the fabric squelch when I pressed my palm against his chest. I reached into his pockets. My fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, a set of keys, and then a small piece of cardstock. I pulled it out. A photograph. A sharp-featured man with slick-back hair and a predatory sneer. Next to it, I found the weapon. A stiletto. 7 inches of thin, needle-sharp steel with a polished horn handle. It was lying in the mud, the blade coated in a mixture of drying blood and white plaster dust. The killer had dropped his tool in the scramble. "He's an Italian, Holmes," I said, checking the man's pupils. "Professional hit, or a street fight that went south fast." Lestrade stepped into the light, his face the color of a guttering candle. "This is Kensington, for God's sake. People don't get their throats cut over garden ornaments here." "It was never about the ornament, Lestrade," Holmes snapped. He was on his hands and knees now, ignoring the blood, staring at the mud. "Look at the footprints. V-shaped indentations. The killer was standing over him, bracing himself. He broke the statue after the kill. He needed the light from that street lamp to see what was inside the fragments. I stood up, my knees cracking like pistol shots in the quiet garden. The wind picked up, whistling through the empty branches above us, a low, mournful sound that felt like a warning. I wiped the pink plaster blood off my hands with a handkerchief, but the smell, that raw, metallic stench of a fresh kill, stayed in my nostrils. "We have 2 statues left," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low-frequency growl. "One in Reading, one in Chiswick. The butcher knows he's running out of chances. He's going to get louder. He's going to get messier." I checked the cylinder of my Webley. The heavy lead rounds glinted under the lantern light. The audit was moving from property damage to a full-blown slaughter. "We need to move, Watson, before the plaster dries on the next corpse." We headed back to the gate, leaving the dead man in his white and red graveyard. London was screaming in the distance, but in this garden, the only thing that mattered was the weight of the steel in my pocket and the countdown to the next smash. The butcher was ahead of us. But not for long. The smell of the Kensington murder followed us like a stray dog. Even in the hansom, with the wind whipping through the flaps, I could still feel that wet, copper weight in my lungs. Holmes was a shadow in the corner, his fingers drumming a frantic, mechanical beat against his knee. He wasn't thinking about the dead man, he was calculating the trajectory of a monster. "Morse Hudson's shop, then Harding Brothers," Holmes muttered over the clatter-clack of the horse's hooves. "That's where the trail starts, Watson. In the white dust of the factory floor." We hit Stepney as the sun began to bleed a weak, gray light through the smog. The Harding Brothers Works was a massive, soot-stained brick fortress that exhaled plumes of smoke. We stepped out, and the air hit me. It was dry, abrasive, and tasted like pulverized stone. Inside, the factory was a scene from a mechanical hell. The noise was a relentless, thud-grind hiss of steam-driven pulleys and iron presses. White dust was everywhere. It hung in the air like a blizzard, coating the rafters, floorboards, and the lungs of the men. I coughed, the grit scratching my throat like glass shards. We moved past rows of wooden racks holding hundreds of identical, headless torsos. It was a graveyard of unfinished men. "Mr. Gelder?" Holmes shouted over the roar of a grinding wheel. A man stepped out of a side office. He looked like a ghost, his hair, eyebrows, and leather apron were completely bleached white by the plaster. He wiped a hand across his face, leaving a streak of pink flesh in a mask of white dust. "We're looking for the Napoleons," Holmes said, his voice cutting through the industrial din like a blade. "The batch of 6. Devine's mold." Gelder spat a glob of gray phlegm onto the floor. "That batch is nothing but trouble. 6 of M. Cast 3 weeks ago. We had a hand on the floor, an Italian named Beppo. Good with a trowel, better with a knife. He went crazy in the middle of the shift. Cut a man in the packing room and bolted. The police took him, but the statues were already out the door." Holmes leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Describe the shift, Gelder. Give me the physical data. Was there anything unusual about the casting of those 6? Gelder rubbed his jaw, the sound of his stubble against the plaster dust was like sandpaper. "Beppo was working the late shift. Just him and the drying kills. He was obsessed with that batch. I caught him once leaning over the mold of the 3rd statue, his hands deep in the wet slurry. I thought he was just checking the consistency, but his face, he looked like a man burying a secret. I walked over to a workbench. I picked up an iron trowel used for smoothing the plaster. It was cold, weighted, and crusted with dried white sediment. I imagined Beppo standing here, the steam rising from the vats, his heart hammering as he shoved something, small, hard, and priceless, into the soft, cooling neck of a plaster emperor. The statues were sold in 2 sets of 3, Gelder continued, pointing to a leather-bound ledger on a slanted desk. I followed Holmes to the book. The pages were thick, yellowed, and smelled of old glue. Holmes's finger traced the ink, jagged, hurried entries. Set 1, Morse Hudson, Barnicot, and the Kensington hit. All smashed. All empty. Set 2, Reading in Chiswick. The reading bust was destroyed 2 hours ago, Holmes whispered, his voice dropping an octave. Lestrade just got the wire. That leaves 1, Watson. Only 1. I checked my watch. 8:15 a.m. The ticking felt louder in the sudden silence as the factory's steam whistle shrieked for a break. That whistle felt like a scream. Chiswick, I said, my hand instinctively going to the bulge of the Webley in my coat pocket. The metal felt like an anchor in a world made of dust. Exactly, Holmes said, turning toward the exit. Mr. Josiah Brown. Laburnum Vale. He's the owner of the last Napoleon. He's sitting on a powder keg and he doesn't even know it. As we walked out, I looked back at the factory floor. The white dust was still falling, silent and indifferent, covering the footprints we had left behind. We were chasing a ghost who left a trail of white powder and red blood, and the clock was running out of seconds. The butcher isn't going to Reading, Watson, Holmes said as we climbed back into the hansom. He's already on his way to Chiswick. He's tired. He's hungry. And he knows this is his last chance to cut the truth out of the stone. I felt a bead of cold sweat slide down my spine. The hunt was narrowing. The 6 emperors were almost gone, and at the end of the line, someone was waiting with a stiletto and a grudge. Drive, Holmes barked at the coachman. And don't spare the whip. The crack of the leather echoed off the brick walls like a gunshot. We were heading into the final act, and I could already smell the ozone and the coming storm. The audit was nearly complete. All we needed was the final signature in blood. The ride to Chiswick was a brutal, bone-jarring sprint. The hansom's wooden frame groaned under the strain, the iron-rimmed wheels hitting every pothole with a violent clack-thud that vibrated through my spine. Outside, the world was a blurred smear of gray brick and soot-stained fog. Holmes sat opposite me, his face a sharp, motionless mask. He was checking his pocket watch, a silver brigade, the lid snapping shut with a crisp, aggressive click every 60 seconds. The anatomy of the crime is changing, Watson, he said, his voice flat and mechanical over the roar of the wind. Beppo isn't just a thief anymore. He's a scavenger. He's hunted through 4 of these shells and found nothing but white dust. He's reaching the breaking point. A man like that doesn't just knock on a door, he carves his way in. I looked down at my hands. There was still a faint, white ghost of plaster dust under my fingernails from the factory. I rubbed them against the rough wool of my trousers, but the grit stayed. I shifted the weight of the Webley. The holster was rubbing against my hip, a constant, heavy reminder that we weren't going to a tea party. We arrived at Laburnum Vale just as the gas lamps began to flicker and die in the morning light. The house was a 2-story brick structure, surrounded by a low stone wall and a thick, overgrown hedge of dead privet. It smelled of wet earth and coal smoke. We didn't ring the bell. Holmes led the way to the side of the house, his boots crunching softly on the frozen gravel. He stopped at a window, the dining room. I looked over his shoulder. Inside, sitting on a dark oak sideboard, was the 5th Napoleon. It was an eerie sight. The bust looked like a decapitated head in the dim light, its blank plaster eyes staring at nothing. It was clean, polished, and untouched. A perfect target. "Wait," Holmes whispered. He knelt by the flower bed. The soil was soft, churned up by the morning sleet. He pointed to a mark in the mud. It was a deep, sharp indentation, the toe of a heavy boot. Next to it, a strange, curved scrape. "He was here," I whispered, my hand moving to the grip of my revolver. The cold steel felt like ice against my palm. "He watched the house." "He didn't just watch, Watson. He measured it." Holmes stood up and moved toward the back door. The wood was solid oak, reinforced with iron strapping. He ran his fingers along the frame. He stopped at the lock. There was a tiny, bright scratch in the metal, a fresh wound. Someone had tried a tension tool here within the last hour. Suddenly, a sound came from inside the house. A heavy, muffled thump, followed by the unmistakable tinkle of breaking glass. "Move!" Holmes barked. We didn't wait for a key. Holmes threw his shoulder against the back door. The wood splintered with a loud, violent crack that echoed off the neighboring walls. We burst into the kitchen. The air inside was warm and smelled of stale bread and floor wax. We hit the hallway, our boots thundering on the floorboards. I rounded the corner into the dining room, my Webley leveled at the shadows. The room was a wreck. The sideboard was empty. On the floor, in the middle of a Persian rug, lay the fifth Napoleon. It was shattered into a dozen jagged pieces. A heavy brass fire poker was lying next to it, still vibrating from the impact. But the room was empty. I ran to the window. It was wide open, the lace curtains flapping in the cold breeze like a ghost's shroud. I leaned out into the fog. Down in the garden, a dark shape was vaulting over the stone wall. "He's got the scent, Watson," Holmes shouted, already leaping through the window frame. I followed him, my boots hitting the soft earth with a heavy thump. We were in a full-speed chase now. The cold air burned my lungs, tasting like iron and ash. Ahead of us, the shadow of Beppo was a fast-moving blur, weaving through the narrow alleys of Chiswick. He wasn't running like a man escaping, he was running like a man who knew exactly where the last statue was. The sixth Napoleon. The final emperor. I could hear the slap 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 of Beppo's boots on the wet pavement. He was fast, moving with a predatory grace that spoke of years in the backstreets of Naples. Holmes was a lean, gray streak beside me, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts. "The sixth one, Watson," Holmes yelled over the wind. "It's at the house of Josiah Brown. If he gets there first, the audit ends in a bloodbath." I gripped the Webley tighter. My finger was on the trigger guard, feeling the tension of the spring. The six Napoleons was no longer a puzzle. It was a race against a butcher who had nothing left to lose but his soul. The fog closed in, swallowing the hunter and the hunted alike. The only thing left was the sound of our racing hearts and the mechanical clank of a city waking up to a murder. The chase through the back alleys of Chiswick was a sensory assault. My lungs were raw, burning with the intake of freezing, soot-clogged air. Ahead, Beppo was a phantom, his dark coat flapping like the wings of a scavenger bird. Every time his boots hit a puddle, the splash crack echoed off the narrow brick walls, a rhythmic sound that kept us locked onto his trail. "He's heading for the Laburnum Vale exit," Holmes shouted. His voice was a rasp, stripped of its usual cold precision. We rounded a sharp corner, my shoulder slamming into a brick chimney stack with a dull thud. The pain was sharp, but the adrenaline acted like a cauterizing iron. We hit the main road just as a dray cart rumbled past. The smell of horse manure and wet hay was overwhelming. I saw Beppo dive under the horse's head, dodging the massive wheels with a fraction of an inch to spare. "Move, Watson." We vaulted over the cart's hitching rail. I felt the heat radiating from the horse's flank as I jumped. We scrambled across the cobblestones, the iron studs in my heels throwing tiny sparks against the granite. Beppo was gone. Vanished into a maze of tenements and coal sheds. Holmes stopped. He didn't look frustrated, he looked like a machine calculating its next move. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted, listening. I could hear the city waking up, the clink of milk bottles, the hiss of steam from a distant laundry, and then, a sharp, high-pitched scrape. "The fence," Holmes whispered. We sprinted toward a 6-foot wooden fence at the end of the cul-de-sac. I grabbed the top rail, the wood was splintered and damp, the paint flaking off into my palms. I hauled myself up. On the other side was the garden of Mr. Josiah Brown. It was a small, meticulously kept patch of land. A gravel path, a stone birdbath, and a dark conservatory attached to the house. The glass of the conservatory was frosted with a layer of white rime, making it look like a tomb made of ice. I saw him. Beppo was crouched at the base of the glass door. He wasn't using a hammer. He was using a diamond cutter. I heard the scree-scree of the tiny industrial diamond biting into the glass, a sound that set my teeth on edge. It was a surgical noise. He reached out with a gloved hand. He gave the glass a sharp, controlled tap. Clink. A perfect circle of glass fell inward, landing on the thick carpet inside with a muffled thump. "Wait," Holmes breathed, his hand heavy on my shoulder. "Let him get the prize. We need the evidence in his hands." My heart was hammering a frantic thump 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 against my ribs. I reached for the Webley. I didn't pull it yet, I just felt the knurled hammer under my thumb, the cold steel a stark contrast to the heat of my skin. Beppo reached through the hole and turned the brass handle. The door swung open on silent, well-oiled hinges. He stepped inside. The interior of the conservatory was filled with shadows and the silhouettes of giant ferns. In the center, on a marble pedestal, sat the final Napoleon. The sixth emperor. Under the morning light, the plaster looked like bone. Beppo approached it slowly. His movements were different now, not frantic, but reverent. He reached out and touched the side of the statue's head. His fingers traced the line of the ear. "Now," Holmes hissed. We jumped the fence. My boots hit the frozen turf with a heavy crunch. Beppo froze. He didn't turn around, he just stiffened, his hand still resting on the white plaster. "Back away from the stone, Beppo," I yelled, leveling the Webley at the center of his back. The front sight of the revolver was rock steady. Beppo didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned. His face was a map of scars and sweat. His eyes were bloodshot, pupils dilated to the edges. He looked like a wolf cornered in a trap. In his right hand, he held the stiletto, the needle-thin blade glinting with a lethal light. "It's over," Holmes said, stepping into the conservatory. The smell of damp earth and ferns was thick in the air. "The audit is closed. You've broken 5. You won't break the 6th." Beppo let out a low, guttural growl. He looked at the statue, then at us. He shifted his weight, the balls of his feet digging into the rug. He was preparing to lunge. I felt my finger tighten on the trigger. The tension in the spring was a physical force. One more inch, and the lead would fly. "Don't do it," I warned. The air in the conservatory felt pressurized, like a boiler about to blow. Beppo's eyes darted to the window, then back to the statue. He wasn't looking for an exit. He was looking for a way to finish the job. He raised the stiletto, not at us, but at the white, unblinking face of Napoleon. "No!" Holmes shouted. The glass of the conservatory suddenly felt like it was vibrating. The hunt had reached the threshold. The butcher was one move away from the heart of the stone, and I was one move away from putting a hole in his. The silence before the strike was deafening. The air in the conservatory was frozen, a pressurized bubble of glass and ferns. Beppo's breath was a ragged, hissing sound, like a leak in a steam pipe. He stood between us and the marble pedestal, his shadow stretched long and jagged across the floorboards. The smell of the room had shifted, the damp scent of greenery was gone, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of the stiletto and the ozone of a coming storm. "One move, Beppo," I growled. My thumb was locked on the hammer of the Webley. The serrated steel felt like a jagged tooth against my skin. "Just one, and I'll put 4 ounces of lead through your spine." Beppo didn't flinch. He looked at the 6th Napoleon with a look of starving intensity. His hand, dirty and scarred, was trembling as it hovered over the white plaster. "It's mine," he rasped. His voice was a dry scrape, like a shovel hitting gravel. "I bled for it. I killed for it. It's inside. I know it's inside." Holmes stepped forward, his boots making a slow, clunking sound on the wooden floor. He didn't have a gun, he just had that cold, predatory stare. "The black pearl of the Borgias, Beppo. That's what's inside. A piece of carbon that cost a man his life in Kensington. You're not holding a treasure, you're holding a death warrant." Beppo's eyes snapped to Holmes. The madness in them was vivid, a bloodshot, frantic light. Suddenly, he lunged. He didn't go for us. He swung the stiletto at the statue. The sound was a high-pitched tink shatter. The thin blade didn't break the bust, it just chipped a jagged flake off the ear. "Drop it!" I yelled. I fired. The boom of the .455 was deafening in the glass room. The muzzle flash was a blinding, orange strobe. The heavy lead slug didn't hit Beppo, it shattered a large terracotta pot behind him, sending shards of red clay and black dirt spraying across the floor. The shockwave of the blast made the conservatory glass rattle in its frames. Beppo stumbled, the vibration of the shot knocking him off balance. Holmes didn't waste a microsecond. He dived. It wasn't a clean tackle. It was a collision of bone and muscle. Holmes slammed his shoulder into Beppo's ribs with a sickening thud. They both went down, sliding across the rug and crashing into a row of potted palms. The sound of snapping fronds and breaking glass filled the air. I was on them in a second. I dropped the Webley and grabbed Beppo's wrist, the one holding the stiletto. His skin was hot, greasy with sweat and plaster dust. He fought like a trapped animal, his muscles knotting under my grip. He tried to drive the blade into my forearm, the silver tip of the steel skimming the wool of my sleeve. "Get the knife, Watson!" Holmes shouted, his voice muffled as he pinned Beppo's throat with his forearm. I twisted his wrist. I heard the pop of a joint. Beppo let out a guttural scream, and the stiletto fell. It hit the floor with a ping and slid under the marble pedestal. I pulled out the handcuffs, heavy, cold iron links that felt solid and final. I jammed them onto his wrists. Click. Click. The sound of the ratchets locking was the most satisfying thing I'd heard all night. Beppo went limp. He lay there on the floor, surrounded by broken glass and dirt, his breath coming in jagged sobs. He looked shrunken, a small man who had chased a ghost until it broke him. Holmes stood up, brushing the white dust and dirt off his coat. He looked at his hands, they were scratched, a thin line of red beading across his knuckles. He didn't care. He turned toward the pedestal. The 6th Napoleon was still standing. It had a small scar on its ear from the stiletto, but it was intact. The white plaster looked almost mocking in the weak morning light. "The hunt is over, Watson," Holmes said, his voice returning to that flat, mechanical calm. "But the audit requires a final settlement." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, brass-headed cane. He looked at the statue like a jeweler looking at a raw diamond. "Let's see what Beppo was willing to die for." I stood there, my heart still drumming against my ribs, watching the white face of the emperor. The conservatory was silent now, except for the drip-drip of water from a broken pipe. The 6 Napoleons were down to 1. And the secret was seconds away from the light. The conservatory felt like a tomb. Beppo was curled in a ball on the rug, the iron handcuffs clinking every time his body shook with a sob. The smell of gun smoke from my Webley was thick and acrid, hanging in the humid air like a poisonous fog. Holmes didn't look at the prisoner. He didn't look at me. His entire universe had shrunk down to the white, unblinking eyes of the 6th Napoleon. "The audit is almost closed, Watson," Holmes said. His voice was a low, dry rasp. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a 10-pound note. He placed it on the marble pedestal next to the statue. It was a cold, transactional gesture. A payment for the destruction about to follow. "The physical evidence is all here," Holmes muttered, more to himself than me. "The factory, the time stamps, Beppo's obsession. The math is perfect." He raised his heavy, brass-headed cane. He didn't swing it like a madman, he gripped it like a surgeon grips a scalpel. He was looking for the structural flaw in the plaster. Crack. The first blow was sharp and precise. A jagged fissure opened across Napoleon's forehead, a thin, lightning bolt crack that bled white powder. The sound was dry, the sound of parched bone snapping. Crunch. The second blow took off the top of the skull. Shards of plaster sprayed across the floor, bouncing off the glass walls with a rhythmic tink-tink-tink. The air became opaque with white dust. It coated my eyelashes and filled my throat with the taste of chalk. Holmes didn't stop. He was dissecting the emperor. He used the brass head of the cane to peel back layers of grainy, porous stone. He was digging into the core, the hidden center where the liquid plaster had once cooled around a secret. Suddenly, Holmes froze. His hand stayed midair. "Watson," he breathed. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on the debris. Inside the hollowed-out neck of the bust, embedded in a thick, grayish lump of unrefined plaster, was something dark. It didn't look like a treasure. It looked like a tumor inside the stone. Holmes reached in with his long, thin fingers. He pried the object loose. It was a small, round sphere, the size of a marble, but it didn't reflect the light like a diamond. It absorbed it. It was the color of a midnight bruise, a deep, oily, suffocating black. The surface was smooth, almost organic to the touch, and it felt unnaturally heavy in the palm of his hand. "The black pearl of the Borgias," Holmes whispered. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Beppo stopped crying. We all stared at the small, dark heart of the mystery. It was a beautiful, cursed thing that had traveled from an Italian palace to a London factory, only to end up covered in the dust of a broken emperor. 10,000 pounds of concentrated sin, I said, my voice sounding hollow in the glass room. Holmes held the pearl up to the weak morning light. It seemed to pulse with a dark energy. This was the why. This was the reason for the stiletto in the garden, the blood on the grass in Kensington, and the shattered faces across London. Beppo didn't want the stone, Holmes said, his eyes fixed on the pearl. He wanted the power it represented. He wanted to own the thing that destroyed him. He turned to the prisoner. Beppo's eyes were wide, fixed on the pearl with a look of pure, unadulterated hunger. He looked like a man watching his own soul being held by a stranger. Lestrade. Holmes called out. The inspector appeared at the conservatory door, his face pale, his uniform covered in the same white dust that coated everything. He looked at the shattered statue, then at the black pearl in Holmes's hand. "You found it," Lestrade said, his voice trembling. "God help us, you actually found it." "The audit is settled, Inspector," Holmes said, dropping the pearl into a small silk pouch. The clink of the stone hitting the fabric was the final sound of the case. "Take the butcher. The stone stays with me until the owners can prove they've paid the price for it." As they led Beppo away, his boots dragging through the plaster dust, I looked at the wreckage of the 6th Napoleon. It was just a pile of cheap, broken stone now. The magic was gone. The terror was gone. London was waking up. I could hear the city's hum, the mechanical, indifferent sound of millions of people starting their day, oblivious to the fact that a dark emperor had just been executed in a glass room in Chiswick. I reached for my Webley and holstered it. The weight on my hip felt lighter, but the smell of the copper and the chalk was still in my lungs. "Breakfast, Watson?" Holmes asked, his voice returning to its normal, brisk tone. "I think I need a drink first, Holmes," I replied. We walked out of the conservatory, leaving the white graveyard behind us. The 6 Napoleons was over, but the memory of that black stone remained, a dark stain on the white plaster of my mind. The audit was closed. But in London, the ledger never stays blank for long. The ride back to Baker Street was silent. The clop-clop of the horses' hooves against the damp cobblestone sounded like a metronome counting down the end of a long, ugly night. Holmes sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the small silk pouch in his hand. Every time the hansom jolted, the black pearl inside made a tiny, dull thud against his palm. It wasn't the sound of a gemstone, it was the sound of a lead weight. "You're thinking about the Italian," I said, breaking the silence. Holmes didn't look up. "I'm thinking about the efficiency of obsession, Watson." Beppo wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a man with a singular, mechanical focus. He didn't see people, he saw obstacles between him and that piece of carbon. We reached 221B just as the morning sun finally managed to punch through the soot, turning the fog into a sickly, jaundiced yellow. I climbed out, my joints creaking like rusted hinges. My coat was a mess, white plaster dust had settled into the fibers of the wool, and there was a dark, stiff patch on my cuff where the Kensington blood had dried. Inside, the room was exactly as we'd left it, but it felt different. The air was stagnant. The smell of the chemical experiment Holmes had left simmering had turned into a sour, metallic hiss. I went straight to the sideboard. I didn't want tea. I wanted something that burned. I poured 2 fingers of brandy into a crystal glass. The glug-glug of the amber liquid was the only sound in the room. I swallowed it in one go. It hit the back of my throat like a hot wire, finally washing away the taste of chalk and gunpowder. "The police will want a full report, Holmes," I said, setting the glass down with a sharp clack. "Lestrade has the body, the weapon, and the prisoner," Holmes replied, finally tossing the silk pouch onto the table. It landed with a heavy, dead sound. "The why is irrelevant to the courts. They only care about the how and the who. But you and I, Watson, we know the why is the only part that breathes." He walked over to his desk and picked up a pair of surgical tweezers. With the precision of a clockmaker, he opened the pouch and pulled the pearl out. Under the direct light of the desk lamp, the thing looked wrong. It didn't have the translucent glow of a natural pearl. It looked like a solidified drop of oil, slick and bottomless. "The Borgia pearl," Holmes whispered. He tapped it with the metal tweezers. Tink. The sound was high-pitched and cold. "It's been missing for a year. Stolen from the bedroom of the Prince of Colonna. Beppo hid it in the factory while the police were at the door. He shoved it into the wet plaster of a half-dried Napoleon, hoping the stone would keep his secret until he got out of jail." I leaned in, staring at the black sphere. "He killed his own cousin for this, Holmes. Pietro Vinucci. The man in the garden. His own blood. Greed doesn't recognize DNA, Watson." Holmes picked up a magnifying glass. He wasn't looking at the beauty of the stone, he was looking for the scars left by the plaster. "There," he pointed. I saw a tiny, microscopic pit on the surface where the alkaline chemistry of the gypsum had bitten into the nacre. I sat down in my armchair, feeling the sudden, heavy weight of exhaustion. My hand was still shaking slightly, a delayed reaction to the adrenaline of the chase and the boom of the Webley in that glass room. I looked at my fingertips. The skin was stained a faint, bruised purple from the ink of the photograph and the residue of the crime scene. "The audit is settled, but the cost?" I shook my head. 6 statues, 2 murders, and a man's sanity. All for a bead of sweat from a dead sea. Holmes dropped the pearl back into the pouch and pulled the drawstring tight. The mechanical work of the silk sliding against itself was the final period at the end of the sentence. "The world is a ledger, Watson," Holmes said, turning off the lamp. The room plunged into a gray, suffocating shadow. Every time someone reaches for the light, they leave a shadow behind. Beppo reached for the blackest light of all. He walked over to the window and looked out at the waking city. I could hear the rumble of the heavy wagons and the distant shriek of a train whistle. "Get some sleep, Watson. The plaster is dry. The blood is cold. And tomorrow, there will be a new debt to collect." I closed my eyes. But all I could see was the white face of Napoleon, shattering over and over again, and the black eye of the pearl staring back at me from the ruins. The 6 Napoleons were gone. And London was already moving on to its next victim. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I drifted off, I heard the crunch of plaster and saw that stiletto sliding toward my throat. I woke at noon, my mouth tasting like old pennies and the sheets tangled like a shroud. I headed downstairs. The air was sharper. Holmes was sitting at the table, but he wasn't alone. He had the anatomy of the case spread out in front of him. He had taken the fragments of the 6th Napoleon, the pieces he'd brought back, and laid them out like a puzzle. Next to them was the black pearl, sitting in a beaker of water. "The chemicals, Watson," Holmes said without looking up. His voice was a clinical rattle. "I'm testing the residue." I walked over, my boots thudding on the rug. The smell was intense, a mix of vinegar, ammonia, and chalky dust. I looked into the beaker. The pearl was shedding. Microscopic flakes of white plaster were drifting off its surface, swirling in the water like a snowstorm. The plaster didn't just hide the pearl, Watson. It fed on it, Holmes explained. He picked up a glass rod and stirred the water. Clink, clink, clink. The sulfur in the gypsum started a slow reaction with the organic layers of the nacre. If we had waited another month, the pearl would have been ruined. Beppo was running against the chemistry of the stone. I pulled out my pipe, but I didn't light it. I just held the wood, feeling the grain. It's a parasite, then. The stone was eating the treasure. Exactly. A mechanical countdown. Holmes reached for a notebook, the one he used for the ledger. He began to write, the nib of his pen scratching against the paper. It was a rhythmic sound, like a telegraph key. I've been tracing the timeline of the Kalana theft, he said, the pen never stopping. Beppo didn't just steal it. He was a mule. He worked at the factory, he had the access, but he didn't have the buyers. He was waiting for a signal from the Venucci family. But the signal never came. The Venuccis were being audited by a rival firm. Internal liquidation. I leaned against the mantel, watching the white snow settle at the bottom of the beaker. So he panicked. He shoved the pearl into the first soft thing he could find, the drying mold of the Napoleons. And then he went to prison for a street brawl, Holmes added, finally clicking his pen shut. Imagine the torture, Watson. 6 months in a cell, knowing your retirement is sitting on someone's fireplace, being dusted by a maid. Every day, the plaster is hardening. Every day, the risk of it being shattered grows. The thought was chilling. A man's entire life reduced to a ticking bomb of plaster. Suddenly, there was a heavy knock at the door. Not a polite knock, a sequence of 3 sharp strikes. I gripped the edge of the table. My nerves were still tuned to the frequency of the stiletto. Enter, Holmes called. It was a messenger from the Italian embassy. He was a small man in a black suit that smelled of mothballs and cologne. He didn't say a word. He just handed Holmes a heavy, wax-sealed envelope. The wax was a deep, blood red. Holmes broke the seal with a sharp snap. He read the single sheet of paper inside. His face didn't change, but his eyes narrowed to thin, dangerous slits. The Kalana family doesn't want the pearl back, Watson, Holmes said, his voice dropping to a low hum. What? I asked, the pipe almost slipping from my hand. They've already collected the insurance. To take it back now would be a legal nightmare. They want it liquidated. They want the audit finalized by a third party. He looked at the beaker. The black pearl sat at the bottom, surrounded by its white graveyard. They've offered a reward for the recovery and disposal of the artifact. A sum that would keep a man in neckties and silk shirts for 3 lifetimes. I looked at Holmes. He wasn't smiling. He looked at the pearl with clinical disgust. The stone is cursed, Holmes. It's got the blood of Kensington and the sweat of Stepney all over it. It's not cursed, Watson. It's just heavy. Too heavy for most men to carry. He picked up the tweezers and pulled the pearl out of the water. It dripped, the black surface shimmering like a dark eye. We have one more stop to make. One more piece of the ledger that hasn't been balanced. Where? I asked. The morgue, Watson. We need to see the man who died for this. We need to see the cost of the plaster before we sign off on the profit. I grabbed my coat. The wool felt heavy, the weight of the city pressing in. The 6 Napoleons were dead, but the ghost of the Borgia was still walking. And it was leading us straight into the heart of London's basement. The hunt was over, but the audit was just getting started. Ready? Holmes asked. Ready, I replied. The door shut behind us with a solid, final thud. The air outside was freezing, tasting of ash and rain. The ledger was open, and the ink was still wet. The London morgue is a subterranean vault where the city's failures are filed away in drawers. The air inside doesn't just feel cold, it feels sterile, a sharp, chemical chill that bites into the back of your throat. It smells of carbolic acid, frozen stone, and that underlying, sweet rot that no amount of ventilation can ever truly kill. We walked down the corridor, our boots making a rhythmic clack 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 on the white tiles. The sound echoed off the low, arched ceiling like a series of small, sharp hammer blows. "Drawer 42, the attendant muttered. He was a gray man with skin the color of old newspaper. He grabbed the heavy brass handle. The sound was a long, grinding shriek of metal on metal as the tray slid out. There he was. Pietro Venucci. The man from the Kensington Garden. Under the harsh, unshielded gaslight, the body looked like a piece of unfinished sculpture, just like the plaster Napoleons. His skin was a mottled, waxy blue-gray. The mortician had sewn up the throat wound, a jagged, black zip of silk thread that ran from ear to ear. It looked like a dark necklace. Holmes didn't flinch. He leaned over the corpse, his face inches from the dead man's skin. He wasn't looking for a soul, he was looking for the mechanics of the kill. "Look at the hands, Watson," Holmes whispered. I leaned in. Venucci's fingernails were broken, the bed stained with a dark, dried crust. But it wasn't just blood. Wedged deep under the nail of his right index finger was a small, white grain. "Plaster," I said, the word feeling heavy in my mouth. "Exactly," Holmes said, his voice a low-frequency rumble. "Venucci didn't just die defending the pearl. He died trying to claw it out of the statue himself. He and Beppo weren't just partners, they were two predators fighting over the same bone." I looked at the man's face. His eyes were partially open, a thin sliver of dull, clouded white showing through the lids. He looked surprised, as if the realization that the stiletto was sharper than the plaster had hit him a second too late. The weight of the pearl in Holmes's pocket felt like it was pulling the whole room down. "The audit is complete, Watson," Holmes said, straightening his back. "The victim was as guilty as the killer. The pearl has its pound of flesh." Suddenly, the silence was broken by a drip, drip, drip. Water was leaking from a pipe in the corner, hitting a metal bucket with a hollow, rhythmic tink. It sounded like the ticking of the mantel clock in 221B. A countdown. Holmes reached into his pocket and pulled out the small silk pouch. He looked at the heavy brass handle of the morgue drawer. "Beppo's cousin is the last of the line. The Venuccis are liquidated. The Borgias are ancient history. And the Napoleons." He looked at the white dust still clinging to his own sleeve. "The Napoleons are dust." We turned to leave. As the attendant pushed the tray back in, that same grinding metal sound filled the room, a final, violent closure. We climbed the stairs back to the street level. The transition was a physical shock. The roar of London hit us like a tidal wave, the rumble of the omnibuses, the shout of the newsboys, and the hiss of a steam cleaner working on a nearby shopfront. Life was moving at a frantic, mechanical pace, completely oblivious to the cold, silent audit happening 20 feet below the pavement. "The Italian embassy expects the liquidation by 5 o'clock, Holmes said, checking his watch. The lid snapped shut with a crack. "How do you liquidate a curse, Holmes?" I asked. He didn't answer. He just flagged down a hansom. We climbed in, the leather seat groaning under our weight. The interior smelled of old rain and stale tobacco, the familiar sense of the hunt. "We don't liquidate it, Watson," Holmes said as we lurched forward into the fog. "We bury it. But this time, we bury it in a place where no one will ever think to look." I watched the city blur past. The gray buildings looked like teeth, and the fog was the breath of a monster. We had the pearl, we had the killer, and we had the corpse. The ledger was full. "One more chapter, Watson," Holmes whispered. The final entry. And then we can wash the plaster off our hands for good. I gripped the side of the carriage. My knuckles were white. The 6 Napoleons was ending, but the coldness of that morgue drawer was still in my bones. The audit was moving to its final, dark conclusion. The hansom didn't stop at the Italian embassy. Instead, we headed east, toward the jagged, industrial skyline of the docks. The air here was thicker, a heavy, greasy mix of river salt, rotting timber, and the sulphurous belch of the coal barges. The sound of the city had changed. It was no longer a rumble, but a clash of heavy iron chains, the screech of steam cranes, and the rhythmic slap-slap of the dark Thames water against the slime-covered piers. Why here, Holmes? I asked. My hand was on the door flap, the wood cold and damp under my palm. The embassy is a stage, Watson, Holmes replied. His silhouette was sharp against the gray fog. A stage for politics and paperwork. I have no interest in being a character in their play. The audit needs a permanent erasure. He pulled the silk pouch from his pocket. The black pearl made that same dead, thudding sound against the leather of his glove. We stepped out onto a wooden jetty. The boards were slick with fish scales and river mud, making every step a slurping struggle for balance. The fog was so dense here you could feel the droplets pricking your skin like cold needles. Below us, the river was a black, swirling void, its surface broken only by the occasional white foam of a passing tugboat. Holmes walked to the edge of the pier. He looked down into the soup. 10,000 pounds, Watson. A king's ransom. A man's life. All contained in a single, calcified mistake. He opened the pouch. The pearl rolled into his palm. In the flat, gray light of the docks, it looked like a piece of coal, indifferent, heavy, and silent. There was no shine, no beauty left in it. It was just a wait. What are you doing? I stepped forward, my boots creaking on the rotting timber. Finalizing the ledger, Holmes said. He didn't throw it with a grand gesture. He simply opened his hand. The pearl fell. I watched it go. It didn't catch the light. It was just a black dot dropping into a blacker hole. Plip. The sound was tiny. A small, liquid gulp as the Thames swallowed the stone. A single ripple moved outward, shivering for a second before the current tore it apart and dragged it into the mud. Gone, I whispered. The taste of salt in my mouth felt like a finality. Not gone, Watson. Just refiled, Holmes said, his voice as cold as the river. In 50 feet of sludge, surrounded by the rusted anchors and the skeletons of 1,000 ships. The Borgias can look for it there if they have the breath for it. He turned back toward the carriage. His face looked lighter, the mechanical tension in his jaw finally relaxing. But the reward, Holmes? The embassy, the Colonna family? I've already sent the wire, Watson. The stone was lost during the struggle in the conservatory. Shattered beyond recovery. I've accepted a modest consultation fee for the capture of Beppo. Enough to cover our expenses and perhaps a new set of chemical retorts for the lab. I looked back at the river one last time. The 6 Napoleons were gone. The statues were dust, the killer was in irons, the victim was in a drawer, and the prize was at the bottom of the world's filthiest river. The audit is closed, I said. And the balance is zero, Holmes added. We climbed back into the hansom. The interior felt warmer now, the smell of the damp leather no longer reminding me of the morgue. As we pulled away, I heard the distant shriek of a ship's whistle, a long, mournful sound that felt like a goodbye to the Emperor and his pearl. We arrived back at 221B just as the lamps were being lit for the evening. The hiss of the gas jets was a comforting, domestic sound. Mrs. Hudson had left a tray of tea and cold beef on the table. The smell of the food, honest, simple, and clean, was the final cure for the copper taste in my mouth. Holmes sat in his chair, picked up his violin, and drew the bow across the strings. The first note was a long, low vibration that seemed to hum in the very floorboards. "Watson," he said, the music still ringing in the air. "Yes, Holmes. Remind me to never buy a plaster bust for the mantel. The molding process is far too unpredictable for my taste." I laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that broke the last of the tension. I sat in my own chair, feeling the give of the cushions. The ledger was shut. The ink was dry. And for the first time in 3 days, the room didn't smell like chalk. The case was over, but the residue remained. In the quiet of 221B, the silence was heavy, a thick layer of peace that felt fragile, like the plaster of the Napoleons themselves. Holmes was still playing his violin, the whine and hum of the strings creating a mechanical vibration that I could feel in the soles of my boots. I sat at my desk, the wooden surface smooth and cool under my hands. I pulled out my own ledger, the one where I kept the rough notes of our adventures. The ink was black, the paper crisp. I began to write, the scritch-scratch of my nib the only competition for Holmes's music. The case of the 6 Napoleons, audit finalized. I looked at the entry. It looked too clean. It didn't capture the grime of the docks, the cold of the morgue, or the shatter of the statues. It didn't describe the weight of the Webley in my hand or the copper smell of Vinucci's blood on the grass. "You're struggling with the narrative again, Watson," Holmes said, the violin bow frozen mid-air. He didn't turn around, but I could hear the smirk in his voice. "It's hard to put a price on a void, Holmes," I replied, setting the pen down. The metal nib made a tiny ping against the glass inkwell. "The price was paid in full," Holmes said, finally turning to face me. The gaslight caught the sharp angles of his face, making him look like a bronze casting. "The ledger is balanced because the prize no longer exists. That is the beauty of disposal. It turns a variable back into a zero." He walked over to the mantel and picked up a small, jagged fragment of white plaster, the only piece of the 6th Napoleon he'd kept. He turned it over in his fingers. The rough smooth texture of the stone was visible even from across the room. "Think of it, Watson. Somewhere at the bottom of the Thames, the black pearl is being buried under another layer of silt every hour. It's becoming part of the geology of the river. It's no longer an artifact, it's just matter." He tossed the fragment into the fireplace. It hit the glowing coals with a sharp clink and sat there, turning a dull, charred gray as the heat began to crack it. "The problem with people, Watson, is that they want things to mean something. Beppo wanted the pearl to mean wealth. Vinucci wanted it to mean power. Even Lestrade wanted it to mean a promotion." Holmes sat back in his chair, stretching his long, thin legs out toward the fire. The creak of the leather was a familiar, solid sound. But to the universe, it was just a high-pressure arrangement of carbon. And now, it's just a high-pressure arrangement of carbon in the mud. I looked at the fire. The plaster fragment was glowing now, a ghostly white-hot. I felt the tension of the last few days finally bleeding out of my muscles. My thumb moved instinctively to the scar on my leg, the old war wound that always throbbed when the weather turned damp. It was a reminder that every audit leaves a mark, whether you want it to or not. "What's next, Holmes?" I asked. The room felt empty, the space where the mystery had been now a vacuum waiting to be filled. Holmes picked up a pile of morning newspapers from the floor. The rustle of the paper was loud in the quiet room. He scanned the headlines, his eyes moving with mechanical speed, flick flick flick, across the columns of ink. The world never stops being noisy, Watson. There's a strange disappearance in a locksmith's shop in Southwark, and a report of a glowing dog on the moors of Devonshire. He tossed the papers onto the table. But for tonight, the ledger stays shut. We've done enough accounting for 1 week. I nodded. I closed my notebook, the thump of the heavy cover signaling the end of the day. I reached for my glass, the brandy was gone, but the warmth was still in my chest. Outside, London continued its grind. The rumble of the last carriages, the shout of a distant drunkard, and the hiss of the fog-dampened street lamps. The city was a machine that never slept, an endless cycle of debt and payment, blood and plaster. But in 221B, the audit was truly over. The 6 Napoleons had been broken, the Black Pearl had been buried, and the only thing left was the smoke from Holmes's pipe, curling up toward the ceiling like a ghost of a case that no longer had a name. "Good night, Holmes," I said. "Good night, Watson." The fire popped, a sharp, crackling sound as the last of the plaster fragment disintegrated into ash.